Well, welcome to another episode of Lighting the Candle, a World That Works. I'm Bill Carell, and I've also got my dear friend Lisa Sheehan, Jan Jeremias, and also Ken Caputo. We are a full complement today, so I have a feeling there's going to be a lot of brain power here. Probably raise the temperature of the earth a little bit. What do you think? So we get together and we have these really cool conversations every week or so. And the whole idea is to access empowerment. If we can do that in an hour between the four of us or three of us, and sometimes the two of us, we're pretty sure that you who are listening to this will get some value out of it as well. And we really hope that it changes the trajectory of your day to a one that enhanced if it's already going well, or to one where you have a choice to have it be enhanced and to have a great day. And as Ken would say, have the best day ever. So with that in mind, I'll pass it around, and like I usually do, I'll toss out a couple of words for us to play with today. With some things that have been going on that I'm aware of, I would like to kind of dissect and distinguish gossip and nattering. How's that for coming from the dark side?
Mhm.
You say nattering?
Nattering.
Okay.
Thank you.
Maybe we should start out with Lisa. Are you looking it up?
I
Yeah.
am.
Well, in the meantime, if you want to identify who you are in the world and maybe even say a little bit about why you're on this podcast for so long. We're pushing almost 2 years here.
Are you ready?
I am.
Mm-hmm.
To natter is to talk casually, especially about unimportant matters. It's also, so chatter is the synonym. So just like for that alone, gossip is usually about somebody else. So nattering is just small talk, it seems. And of course, I think, they've said gossip is one of the most dangerous forms of conversation and the least uh, accomplishing kind of conversation. There's no positive end result for gossip, even though it's the most fun. And I also heard the other end of the spectrum that gossip is a way for two friends to unite. So like nothing unites like a common enemy if that's the purpose of the gossip. But sometimes sharing something kind of cements your relationship or some sort of level of trust. If you're sharing that with somebody, of course, then the two people go off and tell two other people. So it's not.
Well,
It's still not gonna.
Warner used to say you pick your friends by finding out who has the same complaints as you.
Mhm. Mhm. Sometimes it works.
So the word nattering can also be used as kind of like a low level form of gossip. It typically neither
Mhm.
one of the two words is building a world. Both of them are typically either removing energy from it or actually destroying a world. The point of gossip is what? To try to remain anonymous while you're doing harm to somebody else in language?
True. I'll look that one up too.
Yeah, there's a kind of like a feeling of anonymity or secrecy or quietness or, don't you didn't hear this from me or, that sort of thing.
So the definition is as a noun, it's casual or unconstrained conversation or reports about other people, typically involving details that are not confirmed as being true. And then the verb is just to engage in gossip. So
And further, many times are not true. And
right.
that's then that makes no difference because it's just something to pass on.
Well,
So that's just the modern day news. You're just
Yeah,
talking
yeah.
yeah.
about the news now.
24/7, 365. Yes. You are so right. We're out to lunch today, and I asked my friend how are we doing, and he said, "Well, everything is going really well." And he said, "But it's not going really well, and these things that I'm hearing about this, that, and the other thing." And I said, "Well, where'd you hear that?" He said, "Well, it's New York Times, so of course it's true, right?" And I said, well, yeah, you would like to believe, that they have their, the best intentions in mind when they publish things. But I said, are you aware that they've published some things that were not true? And he said, no, I'm not. And I said, all right, so how about that U.S. soccer team, huh?
Have you found a reputable news source that has no
I haven't.
news? I know. I
There
don't
is
know if
Well,
like
one,
the
there's
Wall Street Journal
yeah,
is good
one
or
that I've heard about that I haven't been able to chase down yet that says just the facts, ma'am. Okay. I saw an ad for it, and then I lost the bubble. So I bet if I search it, in Google, I probably can find it. But they basically are saying these are just going to be firsthand reports from people, and we're not going to tell you what it means. Sounds to me like Roger Mudd and Walter Cronkite. Sorry, Ken.
the way it was.
oh, there's you can look like there's websites that have like a spectrum that kind of tells you like how they filter the information, and like sources like NPR tend to be mostly neutral, so
Hmm.
they're a little better, and then there's others that are farther in one direction or another, depending on what it is, whether it's, you know, politics or ideology and stuff like that. So, and there's also, there's some people, there's a guy, I think it's called Tangle. It's a newsletter, and he's a political scientist who kind of presents a dimensional perspective on issues, and he tries to do it as best he can impartially, um but it's still like he still, the challenge is just getting the facts doesn't help, because you need context and you need someone who has some expertise to provide interpretation for those facts.
What
But
was
now
it
the
called?
challenge is, like, you can, you could look at your own X-rays, but if you're not trained as a radiologist and a doctor, do you really know what you're looking at? You don't have the years of training, and that's, kind of the sad thing now is journalists used to feel that, properly presenting information so that people could draw their own conclusions was important. And if they got it wrong, they'd retract it. So, but we've kind of moved away from that, you know, in a large sense now, unfortunately.
What was it called, Kim?
The I think it's called Tangle.
With a
Let me see
K?
if I can find it with a T.
Oh, Tangle. Okay, sorry.
Yeah, I'll look and see if I can confirm that that's, maybe I can find a website here.
I like the name.
Yeah, it's called Tangle.
Thank you.
Ken, I'm having a ball with NPR at the moment.
Uh-oh.
You can do this at home. Google, is NPR biased?
Uh-oh. And
Even on the NPR site, they're reporting that. Let me read it rather than paraphrase. I'll come back here, you wascally webbit. Yeah, so from NPR, um, all right, there's like 8 things I looked at here. Oh, okay, so I haven't seen so well since I had COVID this last time.
oh,
Okay, here it is, June 21st, 2005. Uh, some listeners think NPR already has a subtle or perhaps not so subtle bias. They say NPR is overwhelmingly liberal on a number of issues. So this goes back to 17 years ago,
yeah.
and some would say what the next one says, which is the Hill. Where are you, Wes? Or Quora. This is what Quora has to say now. NPR is extremely ultra-left and totally biased in their news reporting. For example, because the Capitol Hill murderer is an African American and a follower of blah blah blah. And the interesting part of it is I have a feeling this is kind of a Rorschach test, because I know a lot of people would say exactly what you did, Ken, that they're viewed as being in the middle. But again, it depends on who's viewing and who's reporting, right? So are
Yeah.
we seeing a form of gossip there, or are we seeing a form of this is how I see it, so it must be true? And so
So,
going back to what you asked, Lisa, was is there anything out there that you can just totally trust? And I haven't found it.
well, here would be my question: who is determining the level of bias? Who are they? So if this is
100%.
a right leaning who doesn't like what they're saying, so they're saying
Right.
it's left leaning, can you trust the source that's reporting on the source? And that's why I think that's why this guy called this newsletter Tangled, because that's what it's become, and we've all, there's a short attention span, and we all know that you can say lots of things. Like, do you guys know that we ran out of diesel and our country shut down a week ago?
Oh, nice.
It didn't happen, but
Right.
it was reported 3 weeks prior to the election that our diesel supply was gonna be gone, and by Thanksgiving weekend, we were gonna be out of diesel, and it was a
Ah,
misinterpretation of our diesel reserves that didn't take into account production. So, you had a lot of people panicking, and buying up gallons and gallons of diesel unnecessarily, which could actually cause a shortage,
right.
Well, they
and it
actually
was
were.
untrue. And the minute the
Yeah.
election was over, that story disappeared, never
Yeah.
to be heard of again. You
Well,
know,
yes, but they have Ken, the fact is that there have been gas stations with plastic bags over the diesel pumps in the last month.
and
Because
yeah, I actually dug into it because I was curious. Every single one of those was debunked. There was a fire in an Ohio diesel distribution center
Yep.
that temporarily limited their ability to deliver. So it wasn't a supply issue; it was a delivery issue in a specific area that people used as a form of confirmation bias to validate it. Just like
Mhm.
when they were saying that all of the grocery stores were empty and they were taking pictures of Walmart shelves that were empty, and it turned out what they were is they were in stock rotation from like Thanksgiving stuff coming down to put out the Easter stuff. It wasn't,
right.
they're cherry picking to support, a story that they're created. But
Yes.
I found that one very interesting because I actually followed the trail
Yes.
to find out how that was. And the crazy thing was during the time they were reporting it, we were actually producing so much diesel that we were exporting it more than normal. you know, so, but if you were to listen to certain news stations, it served a purpose to create some uproar over that. And then they just jump on to the next story. So I think that's back to your gossip. I think a lot of times what I've learned to do is look at, or is the story, whatever it is, whether it's news or gossip or what, is it designed to elicit an emotional response or a cognitive response? So if it's going to leave you feeling worried, fearful, overjoyed, overprotective, whatever, it's stimulating emotion first. I approach that with a healthy level of skepticism, you know. But if they're giving you data that gives you something to think about, like a complex problem, like, hey, we're going to run out of diesel if this doesn't change in the future. It's not going to affect us now, but it could, 10 years from now or whatever. That's something you can reflect on, you know. So, and that's helped me sort through the noise a little bit.
So the interesting part of what I was saying while you're saying that is the little green bags over the green pump handles that actually did appear confirmed something to somebody. And those of
Mhm.
us who didn't watch any news had no idea there was a shortage going on. We just knew that they weren't able to pump any diesel that day that I drove by there to try to get some. And funny enough, um, it's so cool how everything can kind of come back to hearsay. Uh, I'm waiting right now to have a new natural gas uh, furnace installed. So we're switching over from oil. And so the long and the short of that is that our goal was to run our oil in our tank down to zero about the time that they did the switchover. So we were spot on. And 3 days before the guy was supposed to show up with the new furnace and get going on it, he called me up and he said, "Guess what?
Uh-oh.
My partner had come down with COVID the day before yesterday, and I tested positive today. So this is 2.5 weeks ago. We will not be doing that. I'll have to call you back after Thanksgiving. I still haven't heard back from him. But the
No
point
problem.
is now that we had next to no oil in our tank, I called up my company that I've been doing business with for 40 some years and said, can I get a delivery of 50 gallons? And mind you, I've probably paid these guys close to $100,000 in oil in the last 35 years, right? So they said, well, we've got a minimum delivery of 125 gallons. And I said, this is what I'm trying to accomplish. And they said, I'm sorry. And I said, okay. So rather than calling another oil company, you know what we did? We got a 5 gallon uh, plastic can and then went to the gas station and pumped 5 gallons
Oh,
of diesel
yeah.
and
Put
brought
the
it back.
diesel in.
And so we did that for like, a week and a half. And finally, I just called around last week or 2 weeks, right before Thanksgiving, and said, bring us 50 gallons. They said, no problem. We got you. And I called him back again today. But the rumor about there being a problem with number two fuel oil as well, and the justification for the current pricing being almost $5.50 a gallon, you know,
Mhm.
there's no real correlation to what they're paying for the oil. They're now moving on the announcement there's a potential problem and raising their prices ahead of time.
Mhm.
All that said, do you have any place you can go and find factual data? I mean, unless you get out there with, a measuring stick and calipers and, do you have to see everything yourself these days, in other words?
I don't think so. I think it's just separating out the the eliciting of emotional response agenda or blame, and just, especially if you look at multiple sites and how they report, there's going to be a core of information there, and then usually you can follow that back if you're interested enough.
Yep.
So, but like the diesel thing, at first I just disregarded it because I knew that just was ridiculous.
Yeah.
That was not going to happen. And the source that reported on it, I knew was also ridiculous. So, so that was pretty easy. But then I got curious. So, I started looking it up, and depending on, there's a lot of information about how diesel reserves work. So I actually learned about it. I didn't know. I'd never thought about that before. And, I'm sure, like, if you're a truck driver or something, you're probably well aware of how that kind of things happened. And I bet you that they were aware of the distribution issue, that could affect their ability to, get their trucks going where they needed to. But yeah, I mean, I found that, if you're willing to invest a little bit of time, you just, look at a few different sources and then kind of cull out the facts. And for me, it's been a good mental practice, like just learning to listen and understand, without getting all emotionally tied up in some confirmation bias that you have.
So this is the best thing ever. I just Googled, is there a diesel supply shortage? The first thing that comes up is from guess who? NPR.
Yeah.
So showing results for is there a diesel supply shortage? There's a big difference between the price of gasoline and diesel. That's because right now the U.S. is experiencing one of the biggest shortages of diesel since 2008. Currently, there are only 25 days of supply left, and that number is dropping fast. You know what the date of that was? October 29th, 2022.
Mhm.
Yeah, and that's so whoever reported that also didn't understand. We very rarely have more than 30 days of reserve, and it's dipped below 25 multiple times. That's not unusual. So yeah, so there you go. So even NPR. So you got to
You
look
know,
beyond it.
honestly, I don't fault anybody. I don't fault the people that are talking, and I don't fault the people that are listening. I just wonder what life would be like if I understand how you've been in the last 2 to 3 years is that you just don't pay attention to it, Ken. You know? And I think that's a powerful way to live life if you get interested in something and do the research for it. But the funny part of it is, looking at I was watching a YouTube video and they were talking about something that was readily available information wise. Oh, it was Elon Musk talking about something that had to do with social media and had to do with confirmation bias and had to do with Google. And he said you can go through and you can take copies of what was present on Google 15 years ago and compare it to the same sources on Google today, and they say quite a different thing.
Hmm.
So there's been a grooming of the information and the ability to go back and look factually at some things that happened before, let's say pre 2000. A lot of that stuff has either been removed or the wording's been changed or it's been rewritten in a way that it fits a modern narrative. And I thought that was fascinating. Can you imagine being somebody who's 19 or 20 years old right now, going out and just believing everything that you see when you do a search?
I'm
Whether or
sure.
not you're right, you know?
That sounds like all of human history to me. But it just happens faster now, and we're more aware of it, you know?
The winner
So
gets
I
to
think,
write the story, right?
yeah, I mean, there's always been that, I mean, what's the old sayings? History is written by the winners or something like that, you know? So yeah, I mean, that I don't think that's unusual, and it's kind of funny. I actually been paying really close attention, especially to politics. I find it fascinating right now, but not through the lens of what they're saying. It's who they're being and how they're leading, and if they have a long-term result or a short-term mindset, kind of like shareholders in public companies. They're worried about the next quarter, not the next decade. So, you know, so I find it all fascinating. So, but I don't get caught up in, you know, the thing that they're screaming into the screen to elicit an emotional response. I'm more curious about what's led them to be motivated to do that in the first place. It's profit driven or attention driven or, you know, a genuine good-hearted belief when they're operating under some kind of illusion that they've adopted and bought into. Who knows? But it's interesting.
When you have to sell advertising to keep the lights on and keep paying your employees, there's a suspicious motivation there. And I don't care how, intentional you are in terms of the good. If you find a way to cut corners and make money faster, unfortunately, that's what most human beings are going to do. Not all, but there will be a propensity to do the easy thing as opposed to the right thing.
Yep, that is true.
And Jan, I just wish you wouldn't talk so much.
I'm
You're
just
speaking.
thinking about that. Yeah, I am. I'm just thinking about one is, I think you do choose what you're really passionate about or things that really somewhat affect you, possibly about what you choose and how you investigate and learn. And I don't think, I come from a world of science, and science can be very biased, and depending on where you get your funding from, can be very skewed. And so as a scientist, I have a hard time these days because I feel that, it's always been about money to some extent because you want to get funded in grant funding. So you're always somewhat biased as to to get a result because you want to publish. Otherwise you don't publish, no publish, no perish, you perish. So, but there's this definite skepticism that I go in when I look at the news media, for example, um, talking about scientific data, especially about topics that they don't tend to understand. Um, I had that discussion with somebody early on when they were talking about COVID testing and the fact that they were pooling samples. And I said, I used to do samples of screening thousands and thousands, and you pool samples because it saves money. And you pool 100, 200, 300 people together. And then if somebody tests positive, you go back and test those 300 because I said, but if everybody tests negative, then basically 301 tests versus 300 individual tests saves a lot of money and a lot of resources and a lot of personnel. And, people would say, oh my gosh, they're pool testing. And I used to be like, you don't understand why they do it. And so I think that people don't understand and they kind of make assumptions without full knowledge of reasoning.
Again, whatever the degree is after your name, you have a point of view, and people just typically love to be right. And if they're a contrarian, then they love to be right about being a contrarian. And I think that was one of the problems that most of the lay people during the COVID cycle had, is that we had many different scientists all trying to say what the data that only they had seen means. And so trying to help people survive, trying to help people understand, avoid getting sick. I have a feeling all their motivations were the same. But as soon as there was a party line from the WHO, and all the health organizations in the United States, it seems like almost immediately there were other people that were popping up going, we got history dealing with other things that show that this isn't going to probably work out well for us if we follow these procedures. So everybody, how many times do you think we heard in 2 years, follow the science or listen to the science, and whoever was speaking represented themselves to be the science?
All the time.
Yeah, I think one of the interesting things in watching it was there's again, I think it comes back to the addiction, literal addiction to the dopamine kick you get from confirmation bias. And if you add in
Yep.
money and attention to that, so like to me, it always felt like there was a lack of an integrative approach. So like you had a lot of people did really well for themselves selling homeopathic and supplements and saying you need vitamin D and zinc, you don't need a vaccine, for example, if you're thinking. So instead of how could these things all create a web of immune defense, and what would be sensible? And also, from my understanding of science, you test things and some things hold up to be true and some things don't. So a scientist isn't saying do this because it'll work. They're saying do this because we think it'll work, and then we're going to need to pivot. But when you're in an environment where someone is standing over your shoulder, ready to scream in your face that you're wrong and they told you so, and they're trying to, and then they're cherry picking data and trying to create an illusion of how you're wrong. Now you spend all your time arguing over who's right and who's wrong and who's going to capture the most attention instead of working together. So, and that was, again, now we're back to leadership. I saw a lot of polarization in leadership. So the human element failed because there wasn't a common focus on how do we mitigate the risks of this novel disease, especially when you have people who refuse to even believe it exists, still don't think it exists. So what do you do with that,
But then it keeps coming back to being a battle of two ideas, right? Either for or against, without having a whole field to look at in order to find another way to go. Someone comes out with, this is what it is, this is how it works, this is what you need to know. And then someone comes out and says, well, that's partly right, but you also have to have this. And then someone else comes out and goes, you're both wrong. This is what it is. And I don't know about you, but I think most people just kind of got to the point where it was like on any issue, not just COVID.
Mhm.
Yeah, and I think it's the premise. You just voiced the premise that caused you built it on a faulty foundation. Not you, but the way that they were speaking about it. Because person
I'll
number
own that.
two should say, "Hey, I see gaps in that, right?
Yep.
And here's what I'm seeing." And then person one says, "That's interesting. Let's work together and see what that looks like in real time." The third person says, "You're both wrong," and they both look at him and say, "Why?" And our focus is how do we find the best solution for the population that we're serving, as opposed to how do I capture as much of the opportunity in front of me as possible in this limited window of time. It's like a fire sale. so so that's what it felt like. So now, no, so what does everybody do? Instead of being open to being wrong, they have to defend themselves because wrong can be dangerous, because of they're still attacking Fauci. I mean, it's like they demonized him. I don't know. I mean, I'm sure that there were things he could have done differently, but that's what people do, you know? So, but yeah, I found it all very, very interesting and very telling. Again, looking at people who are in leadership positions or positions of influence and how they chose to represent themselves and function as part of a larger dynamic.
There's a kind of an interesting, I will call it it's a system at work. And this is true for our generation in the last 20, 25 years, probably going back to what was his name? The evangelist who squandered money and had sexual relations, Jimmy Swaggart, right? And Michael Jackson and a dozen other people who the media just absolutely loved to knock off whatever throne they had been on, where people admired them and really appreciated who they are. And it seems like anybody, including Fauci, who stands up and says, "I'll be responsible for this," uh, sooner or later, there's a group of people that are their whole job is going to be to take them down.
Yeah.
And it's a new, the cancel culture has always been there in a subtle fashion. And I think that I would say that the worst manifestation of gossip is the cancel culture, in my opinion. It's the least appropriate way to have a discourse, in the public square. That if somebody says something that you disagree with, that you remove them, you take away their ability to make a living, you know, and it's an unfortunate reaction to I don't know what would it be the reaction to?
I find that one funny too. I just thought that was capitalism. If
Right.
someone doesn't like it, they don't feed it any energy, and if enough people don't like it, it it dies. Whether it's a product or a person or whatever. So, and I understand what you're saying, Bill, where it's more strategic. But again, I mean, there's always been boycotts of products or people or ideals. It's just interesting, and I find it really interesting when you label it something like that. Now, what have you done? You've created a target that people can rally around for the purpose of attacking, and and it happens in all the directions from all the ideologies, but they want that confirmation that someone else did it and they see. Yeah. So I just find it so interesting how, again, it's like, okay, why are people turning away from that? Why are they turning away from that so aggressively? What is it about what that person did or what that company represents, whatever it is, that's caused this response? But that's not the conversation, you know?
Right, but
Jen,
yeah, I was gonna say, but the response is, and the reason people do it is because they don't wanna take responsibility for anything themselves. So if they
mm,
can lay blame on someone else, it's very easy to say, "Oh, well, this is the reason, so and so is the reason for this entire thing happening." And then I've kind of not taken responsibility. So for example, oh, this and this happened because of COVID. But the fact that I eat junk food and I don't take care of myself has nothing to do with the fact that I'm susceptible
right.
to disease. And that was my whole issue, regardless of what side you were on, is they weren't talking about how to take care of yourself, which bothered
Yeah.
because no matter which side you were on, everybody needed to like eat better, get outside, move, and that would have like helped a lot for overall emotional well-being and physical well-being. But nobody talked about that, or it wasn't stressed as much as some other topics were stressed. And so I think
Beca-
that the easy way to lay blame is because this way people don't can say, oh, well, it has nothing to do with me. And I couldn't have done anything about it.
I had an interesting experience with that because I kind of had a similar thought about that, and then ended up with some conversations with people who were at risk, and the conversation was basically, looking back, I made poor choices that are not quickly reversible. And now I'm here and I have to deal with it. So, all these people who are not overweight telling me I need to lose weight when that's an 18 to 24-month challenge that I'm facing, how does that help me not die today? It's like, it'd be like the doctor saying, all right, I know you have you just had a heart attack and you need bypass surgery, but if you hadn't, if you didn't have so much cholesterol in your arteries or whatever, you'd be fine right now. We wouldn't be doing this. It's like, how does that help me? So I think there was I, I don't know how that expressed itself, but I heard that a lot, especially in, the fitness and wellness industry, because I'm pretty keyed into that. There was, you had to remember to practice compassion for the fact that,
Right.
you've got a crisis now. So we should be talking about, a healthier lifestyle and, all of the things that lead to a stronger immune system and, all of that. But in the moment, you got a disease that you're at risk. And, the guy's saying, well, if you were like me, you wouldn't be having this problem. If you're interpreting it that way, that's not going to be good for anyone. So it was really interesting. The conversation should have been had 25 years ago, you know?
No, absolutely.
Yeah.
The other thing that I don't know, I think if you talk about compassion, was this whole idea of people who technically could not get vaccinated, for example, because they have a health reason that
Mm,
and the lack of compassion for those people, and the assumption that they were anti-vaxxers or that they
right.
even any vaccines or whatever, and that wasn't the case. They couldn't get vaccinated, and they were penalized, and they were like, they lost jobs because they couldn't get vaccinated, and
Hmm.
it goes on and on. So I think it's that lack of compassion goes on that side too.
Oh, it was all over the place. And again, it was, what did you have? You had people saying it's good or it's bad, and
Hmm.
you should be punished if you take it, or you should be punished if you don't. So
Right.
not, how do we protect people who can't do this for whatever reason?
That's right.
And how do we inform people so that they can be educated and know whether or not, so that they can do an honest risk assessment, as far as taking the vaccine versus not. And there
Right.
wasn't a lot of that. It was all, this is why you should, this is why you shouldn't, and you'll be punished based on who was judging you for that decision. It's
Yeah.
interesting.
Hmm.
Even more so, if you remember, the foundation of all of the vaccines at the beginning was we do not have time to develop an antigen, and get roll that out to enough human beings. So we have to come up with something else that will be able to destroy the molecular structure of this particular virus. It is not intended to keep you from getting it. It's only intended to keep you from dying. That's what got said in March of 2020. When are we going to get it? When are we going to get it? Now we finally got it here. And then most of the mainstream media was going, when they were talking about the people who were anti vaxxers, or even just the people who hadn't gotten around to getting it yet. You're a spreader. You're killing people. You don't have the right to not get vaccinated. And then after that, when people did get vaccinated and found out that they could also be a spreader, after the mainstream media said this stops the COVID virus with you. It will not go anywhere else. It will not be transmitted. So once you've had the vaccine, you should be able to go out about your life. They didn't know what they were talking about. They were selling advertising, in my opinion. And the more they could keep us plugged in and worried and anxious about what the real truth was, once we heard something that we either agreed with, as Ken would say, with a confirmation bias, or gave us comfort because it's an area we have no expertise and they sound like they know what they're talking about. Isn't that how people decided if they were going to listen to Rachel Maddow or if they were going to listen to, CNN, or if they were going to listen to Fox News, something lined up with who they already knew themselves to be, and they got comfort out of it somehow, and that's where they went to get their information. Now, was any of that information ever right? How are we ever going to know?
Jan, with your science background, this was I'm just kind of curious how accurate this timeline sounds, because my understanding was one of the main causes of a slow, like vaccines take a long time because of funding. And when you take the brakes off the funding, that can accelerate, which is what we experienced.
Mhm.
And the challenge is if you get a large enough percentage vaccinated, that reduces the risk of variants. And the original vaccine was stronger against the original variant, but it didn't get into enough people, so it mutated, and that reduced its efficacy. Is that somewhat accurate? Where's the gaps in that story?
I mean, I think that's somewhat accurate, but I think that you have to remember, okay, bacteria, a virus, their main goal in their existence is survival. I mean, that's really all they're thinking about is mutation. Like, how can I mutate so that I can survive in the next host? If you were a bacteria or a virus, like that's what your objective is I need to find a
Right.
host where I can survive for the longest period of time. And if I can't survive, then I'm going to mutate because I want to survive. So I'm going to do some mutation that's going to allow me to survive ongoing. So I'm just going to keep on mutating. So unless you can absolutely guarantee that everybody gets the vaccine, basically at the same point of time, which wasn't even possible. It was almost kind of like there were going to be mutations. Does that make sense? Because it took a while to roll out. So while it's rolling out, then you still have people who haven't gotten vaccinated yet, who have COVID. And are shedding it. And then therefore, so it's almost like it's going to mutate.
Mhm.
I mean, part of me wonders, and I've had some really intense conversations with scientists and non-scientists, like, no, and I'm not saying I want, don't get me wrong, I'm not saying I want people to die, like, or whatever, is what would have happened had they done nothing. Because basically there wouldn't have been this perpetuation to mutate because people would have gotten sick, they would have died, and then everybody else who got it would survive. So, and just it's kind of prolonging it the more you vaccinate. So I'm not going to say my opinion, but there are those different beliefs. Like, what would have happened if you would have done nothing? And then it would have taken its natural course, like it's done in different eras during time, during different pandemics or epidemics. And eventually it goes away. So, I don't know if that
So,
helps at all.
well, there's another whole thread. And how did we get the vaccines that we got? Because you have to remember when they first started developing these vaccines, there were less than 300,000 known cases in the world. So they defaulted back to other, using the word cleanser is a good one because the RNA strand and DNA strand is able to be broken down by another type of a compound that can go in there and be more attractive, you know, uh, than the way that it's set up right now. So it dissolves it. It's like putting a sugar cube in water. But the point is this: is that they used resveratrol and they were talking about hydrochloroquine. And remember all these things in the early days, March, April, and May. That we have a lot of experience with these drugs in other areas. We also knew pretty well what worked with the H1N1. We don't have time to come up with an antibody based solution here. So we have to find something that we've got a lot of experience that actually cleans. And so that's the direction that they went. There's other studies that I've seen. I don't know if you guys have as well. And we're getting deep in the weeds here, which I think is really cool. But again, we're just kind of discerning whether it's all gossip or if there's anything there that's even useful to us. But did you see the study that basically said they took a population of people who had been vaccinated and a population of people who had not been vaccinated, and they found out that people who had not been vaccinated had a 86% survivability, and people who had been vaccinated with the first dose had a 46% survivability. So, what does that mean? Does that include 200 or 300,000 seniors that were ventilated to death? Does that include? What does it include? The whole point is we will never know unless we compare like what happened in Africa. Africa was one of the least vaccinated areas in the entire world, and they suffered the least amount of death. What does that mean? Is there something in particular to their chemistry or their diet or something of that nature where it just wasn't a hospitable host at a lethal level, for COVID?
Or
And the
were they
other,
better about mitigation? There was a story about someone in Spain saying, "Why are the signs saying please wear a mask only in English?" And the bus driver said, "Because only English speaking people are angry about wearing masks." I mean, there are cultures where they do that, you know, anytime someone's sick, they put a mask on so that they don't get other people sick. And it's not about freedom or rights. It's not a polarizing thing. So, and I'm not saying it's that, I'm just using that as an example, but maybe in Africa it had nothing to do with, their natural immune system. It had to do with they were willing to do other things to protect each other. I don't know the answer. It's just, but you're absolutely right. The context
yeah,
is so key because you can throw out all kinds of numbers that support a position, you know, but
yeah,
what's behind them? And it just strikes me how it's really interesting to me how difficult it is to have both and conversations where it's okay, it's going to take time to roll this out. Let's try these other things and see if they work. You know what? We tried it, that didn't work so well. Oh, I thought it was a good idea. Let's let that go. Let's move on to the next thing. Hey,
yeah,
it's going to take time for us to get to herd immunity or whatever. I mean, but you couldn't have it's like our political environment right now. No one wants to talk about the fact that you can do multiple things at once. you you can approach multiple problems. That's why you have multiple committees and you have, hundreds of legislators. It's not a bad thing unless you want to not have people focused on an integrated approach to solving problems. You want to drive a wedge that keeps them from really, really embracing complex solutions, which are the ones that usually tend to work.
But to that point, Ken, I think that people don't understand scientific processing. The
Hmm.
fact that, of learning something, especially with a disease like this. So people would get really upset when, let's say, the distances change that you could be again, like with someone, first it was,
Hmm.
6 feet, 9 feet, like, and then they would, and they would quibble about that, or,
Yeah.
not wearing masks, when really, some of it is a learning process. Like you really don't know. And you do it and you're like, okay, you do an experiment and you say, okay, you have to, if someone is within 4 feet, okay, this is spread, or the bacteria will, if it's aerosolized after a certain point, it dissipates and it doesn't affect people. But people don't understand that that takes time, especially in our culture where
Yeah.
everybody wants every decision or everything to be decided yesterday. And so all of a sudden they
Mhm.
don't understand that there is a process by which you learn things when especially when you're dealing with a situation like that of unknowns. I mean, I worked in research back in the original time of HIV. I was, working in a lab and we worked on HIV. And I just remember like what we like didn't understand about HIV itself, like
Sure.
what we didn't know, and the fact that we were more scared of the populations we were dealing with were very high in hepatitis. Hepatitis B was really high. So we were more we were more fearful of getting hep B
Mhm.
than we were of getting HIV. But this whole idea of blood transmission or body fluid transmission and what that meant and everything. And so there was really no idea. And it was all like, okay, like it's all experimental error and you have to
Mhm.
just figure it out. But in a system like this, where people are not used to having to wait for anything, And I think that that's when I would watch the news or people would get upset. Well, they're lying to us because they said we had to be 4 feet yesterday, and today they're saying 6 feet. And I'm just
Yeah,
like,
it's like that's called learning.
right, exactly.
You take the Wayback Machine a month and a half earlier when we believed it was surface transmitted, and we spent
Oh
millions of
yeah,
dollars
yep.
Yeah.
cleaning buildings and cleaning furniture and fixtures and all that sort of thing. And the sad part of it is we went through 8 or 9 weeks, and that is something that could have been lab tested and proven in a period of 24 to 48 hours, to where you at least had a viable, a correlation, if not a one-to-one correspondence. So how did they find out that it was transmitted aerosol? It was when they finally did a little bit of testing in a lab with how far they thought a cough would go.
Mhm.
And then they realized, after testing the surfaces in that room, finally, it isn't being transmitted at all by surfaces. It's people talking, breathing, yakking, smiling, all that good stuff. What does that come back around to? How many experts were there? How many paid talking heads got on the TV, on the internet, everywhere that we went to, and spouted their opinion as fact?
You know what I saw? I
Yeah.
saw humans who have expertise who were speaking as best they could in a situation that none of that hasn't happened in 100 years. And and I guarantee they had blind spots. They probably were basing those decisions on how other viruses they've had experience with operate. And the challenge is, we're all sitting back like the armchair quarterbacks saying, "Oh, well, you should have. Why didn't you do that? Or what were you thinking?" So again, it's all of that attacking judgmental language instead of, "Hey, you know, someone didn't look at that for future, as you're building a new playbook, maybe this is something we should consider a little earlier on." And yeah, maybe some people should be held accountable. Maybe some people should be fired. But I bet you just no, I mean, look at business. It's really easy for the customer to get mad about an experience they have without knowing just the chain of events from people trying to do the right thing that led to not the greatest of outcomes, and it wasn't personal or even intentional, but then the angry customer can go blast you with reviews and they can hold a grudge and they can want a consequence. And now what's the focus? Not on doing better or on adjusting and, moving fluidly and adaptively. It's on being angry, you know?
Yeah, I'm always reminded, having gone through that period of time from the early 1980s, when AIDS was totally misunderstood, and when so many of my friends' names were being stitched into the quilt until the quilt became so massive that they just stopped doing it. It was just too many people. But I had two really good friends, that I knew personally, that both died of AIDS. And the I think the mysterious connection here was Fauci, and also I can't remember what her last name is. Doctor it begins with a B, but I thought she was kind of like the rudder, and Fauci was the wind in that, leading the charge. But both of them were experts in HIV, and unfortunately, they started treating it like it was a pandemic before they actually had the numbers for it to be a pandemic, which is why we had a 2-week lockdown to keep it from being a 100-year experience. Remember, flatten the curve, 2 weeks, we're all going to stay home. And then instead of having all of us stay home, they had 30% of us stay home. And 70% went around doing their business because they were, what was the word?
Essential.
Essential. So the long and the short of it is the whole thing was kind of goofy from day one. And it made sense what they were saying. And we went along and we complied as much as we possibly could, both as an essential worker and as a non essential worker who was quarantining or whatever. But in the meantime, Ken, what lessons do we take away as listeners, to this kind of speaking in the future? How do we behave? How do we react inside when we have something that's going on that looks like it's actually putting the existence of the world at stake?
I like what the book, The Four Agreements.
Hmm.
There's a follow-up book, The Fifth Agreement, and it's to be skeptical and learn to listen. And I think the challenge was there was very little listening going on, um, and the skepticism was misdirected, in my opinion. So the skepticism was anything that was gonna not align with what you were thinking, so there wasn't listening with, like that, okay, I mean, who is truly essential, and I think that would have been a very, if you look at the complexity of it, how many people were relying on fast food places to survive through that, like would literally starve. We're dealing with food insecurity. I mean, I don't know the answer to that. So how much of our infrastructure of 350 million people would have collapsed if you pulled a larger part of that population, so again, my understanding was that was all about mitigation, which means you're trying to slow it to keep the hospitals from being over, and we didn't know. So you make a decision, but then everybody's so quick to judge it, and say their piece of why it was or wasn't working, that no one was talking about what was actually happening and how to move through it.
Yeah.
So I feel like, and that's honestly is one of the things that I learned working, especially when I had a larger team of employees, if they were more interested in defending and assigning blame than they were in what the question we would always ask each other is, what is the result we're trying to produce? And we'd have our emotional reaction, we'd have our judgment or defensiveness, but then we let it go so that we could all work together towards the result that we agreed we were trying to produce. So, and if they couldn't do that, they didn't work for me. That it just didn't matter how talented they were, or they just had to align. But how do you do that? Even within our country, we can't even agree what result we want to produce. so, so you kind of have, a real challenge with, but I think it starts with honestly listening, not saying you're listening, but what you're really doing is waiting to reinforce the position you already hold, you know?
I think that kind of lent itself to, at least for me, especially, was a complete new level of disillusionment. I didn't know who to believe, and so I just
Mm,
almost stopped listening because it was almost easy. And I've got to believe that there's a ton of people that feel the same way. Like I'll have to just decide for myself, and that's how I base a lot of my decisions. My mother has COPD, so we weren't going to get together unless I had a vaccine, and I didn't even have time to think about whether I believed in it or not. It was
mhm.
like that kind of situation, and I didn't believe anybody that was telling of any expert that was telling me things. So, I think everybody's in that same boat in all sorts of especially the national things that are going on politically and everything else. It's like, who do you trust?
Yeah.
And that's probably why I started the conversation. Like, is there a place that you can go? Because it's just, it's disillusioning to figure out that that's where everybody is, that there's nobody out there.
I think it
Well,
really comes down to a new generation of leaders
Yeah.
that have a different perspective. Like when I was in the service, I had an NCO who was great, and one of the things that he would brief us. This is the mission, and things are going to go wrong. He says, we may have to backtrack. We may walk up the wrong hill. We may dig foxholes in the wrong place. And if that happens, I'm going to communicate that to you. And then we're going to work together to fix it. And we really respected him as a leader because he was telling us his truth at that time based on the information he had. And he was also saying, I could screw this up. I could read the map wrong. Any of us could. But we got to stay focused on what's important. I can remember some other leaders where it was all about them being right and being loud and being shiny and getting their next promotion. And frankly, we didn't have a lot of trust in them. So when they would say something, we're on the wrong hill, there'd be a lot of grumbling,
Yeah.
and the only difference was in the leader and the way they represented themselves and what they were committed to. So I don't see a lot of, there is some healthy leadership out there, but not enough of it. And maybe if there was more of that, it would make a difference.
Definitely. Ken for president.
No, thank you. Nope.
I can tell you from statistical quality control, and Jan can bear me out on this, that if you want to know if a process is stable, capable, or is repeatable, you have a very small bit of room, with Six Sigma. And in most cases, in any system, if it's more than 3 to 4% um, non-functioning, then it's 90% non-functioning. A 95% accuracy rate means the 5% is actually putting enough doubt into the whole system that nobody trusts it any longer. And then you start having all these little subsystems that start to get built. So when you have a leadership that is misaligned, and they are the 5%, the leadership are creating more people that are following different trains of thought that all think that their belief is the correct one and the right one. And then it always seems to come down to a dichotomy, this or that. Like you said earlier, Ken, it's like nobody is sitting there. However, I got to tell you, I'm empowered because I was watching a panel last week where what they were saying was, how do we use our best thinking and our best intentions to move the world forward after an abject failure like the one we just completed?
That's a
Let's
great question to be asking.
yeah,
Yeah.
let's agree that didn't work. Okay. Now what? Now how do we figure out a line that we can follow that makes sense to people and doesn't have them disrupt their entire life while we're trying to get the answers? And we're working to, I'll paraphrase, as the best that you can just for today. You know, if you're giving it your best and just for today with no eyes on whether it's going to be, deemed a failure or success tomorrow, how much progress can we make if people just do their best right now?
One more thing that's kind of interesting. I teach this in leadership training, just using caution when speaking in absolutes. So like the phrase abject failure, was there anything successful? Was there any value that came out of that? And how do we put our minds to recognizing that instead of just discarding the whole thing as not having, yes, it didn't work as well as it could have. I think it could have been a lot worse, and who knows, maybe if we'd all just exposed each other, it would have mutated faster and killed off 80% of the global population. I don't, we don't know. So probably not. But then again, you know, I we don't know. So I guess it's always like being careful about. I find it helps to to look in the gray, and not just dismiss something completely out of hand. Find the gems in it.
Yeah, I think what I'm speaking to is the unfortunate nature of people that they can't handle multiple trains of thoughts and multiple what ifs at the same time
Yeah,
for
yeah.
everybody. And so they need to, for their own, you know, well-being and for their own, security and safety, and not being either in fight or flight where they can just function and do their jobs in their lives, they align with whatever favorite news source they have and believe everything that
Mhm.
they are being told. And mostly the ones that I have problems with are the subliminal things that they're left with, that they don't even realize that they've been trained. You know,
Mhm.
listen to the same thing over and over and over again for 25 years. All of a sudden, you can't hear anything,
Mm-mm.
So
Yeah.
you at home, don't believe a damn thing that we're saying, okay? Ask your questions, go out there and beat the trees and get your own fruit. But guess what? if you live a life where you're questioning and you're empowered to keep looking and seeking and finding your best life, it's a lot better than sitting back and waiting for somebody to give you a go that never comes, in my humble opinion. And I'm not saying that absolutely. I would say more often than not, you're going to find out that being a happy camper has more to do with how free you feel to do the next thing you want to do.
And how lucky most of us are to be able to do that.
This is a true statement.
That is true. Yep.
So with that said, anybody have any wrap-up comments? Jan?
Well, good.
Lisa?
I'm just going to be grateful for my disillusionment right now.
It's one possible way to be. Go with it.
Yep.
Mr. Ken?
Oh, I talked enough. I get excited about this kind of stuff. I already
Yeah,
said
you
plenty.
Love it.
Me too. And I absolutely love the difference of perspectives. And I absolutely love the fact that we have a lot of different disciplines that are represented here. And as far as I'm concerned, Jan, you will always be the science.
I've always, once a scientist, always a scientist.
Yeah.
My friends always tell me that. They're always like, oh my gosh. And I'll be like, it's genetic.
It's kind of funny as you say that, Jan. In some countries, there's like mandatory, like you got to do a year of military service or whatever. Wonder what would happen if everyone did a mandatory 6-month science internship, like learned how to think that way,
That was one of the reasons I didn't go, in Europe, at least when I was doing my training and everything in Europe, to become a doctor, you have to do research. There's like a research element to your degree. And in this country, there isn't. And I always thought that was a big drawback because I feel like I always said as a lab director, I think doctors would, if they would think twice about sending people for tests they really don't need, if they realize the labor and the costs involved. Because if somebody doesn't have something, then, it's not even, then why do it? But they're
Right.
very used to, at that time, they were very used to checking boxes. So on a lab form, for example. And so I always said that I was, I wanted to go to a doctor. Like MD PhDs to me were always kind of, I was in awe of people who were physicians who also had taken the time to become a scientist, because I figured they have much better, no offense, but they have very good problem solving skills usually, because they're used to solving problems. So
Yeah, it just struck me how, and even just thinking that way, because it's not, when you're dealing with kind of, like that environment, your opinions are a lot less relevant. You can explore things, but then you're going to get quantitative results that you're going to have to frame with. And I think that to Bill's point, we can be subtly influenced because we give too much weight to the things that we think instead of the things that we've actually tested and generated a result that we can impartially look at. So yeah, maybe we should all spend 6 months being scientists. I wonder what that would do to our future leadership generations.
yeah, I think that's a good point, because I think that, data is data. I mean, to get an actual test result or data or number, it's very hard to dispute if the machine is calibrated correctly and all that kind of stuff. Like, I mean, if everything is, then kind of say, okay, well, that's what it should, like, that's what it is. Either way, good, bad. There is no good, bad. It's just numbers. It's just information. If you want to say it that way, it sounds better than numbers, information.
Well,
either the mold grew in the petri dish or it didn't.
Right, exactly.
You're looking past the most important part of the scientific method, and that is that it elegantly takes your opinion and changes it into a hypothesis. Where there's no harm, no foul for getting it wrong. It's called research.
That's right.
And if we did that approach more often, and then went and did our testing, And the confirmation bias part of testing, where you look at the results that you like as opposed to objectively, all the rest of that sort of thing kind of comes down to how what are the controls on the science? What are the motivations of the scientist and the outcomes, and are they related to something that's not necessarily good for mankind, but good for the company or good for your pocket?
Mhm.
So
Yeah, that's the challenge, is that human element creeps in,
Right.
you
there's
know.
a
Exactly.
good roadmap there, though, isn't there, Jan?
Well, because there's never. It's like the data is the data, and no result is a bad result because it's a result and it's information. So if it didn't work out the way you thought it was going to work out, well, that's the way it worked out, and according to those experimental parameters, that's what happened. And so if you want it, like, so something either has to change. I mean, if you're not going to end, let's say, the research by saying, okay, well, and that sometimes depends. Sometimes it's financial limitation because what you want to do, you can't do financially, or it's that technology isn't available at the moment. So maybe that's, you know, deadens it. Or maybe it's just the fact that I have to change these experimental parameters and see what happens because I got a result. This was the information. If I think the result should be different, something has to be changed. And it's not like you're looking for that result, but if you have a hypothesis which you believe is true, then you're going to keep on changing and altering and learning to see if that is the case.
100%. I think that is a good end cap for our particular podcast today. It's been wonderful, very enjoyable, and very animated. I absolutely love this conversation. I hope you did too at home, and thank you for listening to us. Remember, we are lighting the candle, a world that works, and we wish for you empowerment, and we want you to know, always and everywhere, we love you. Bye-bye for now.
Have a good week.
Have a good week.
You've been listening to Lighting the Candle, a world that works, part of the Exvadio Podcast Network. You can catch us each week, as well as the rest of the network, at exvadio.com/podcasts, as well as the Apple Podcasts app, Google Podcasts, Spotify, iHeartRadio, Stitcher, Audible, Amazon Music, and wherever you find podcasts.